when Justin and us elders were planning on his absence this month, we knew he would be back today. That's not an accident that they're here today. That was actually planned. But I asked Justin, for continuity's sake, if I could just carry through the whole month, and that would give him a good month sabbatical to rest and recuperate from camp and all the other things he's got going. So we're going to carry on. We have one more week, and then in 2 weeks, Justin will be back. We need to do a prequel to today's story before we launch into it. The prequel is Moses is ready to lead the Israelites into Canaan. And before he does it, as a wise commander, he wants to reconnoiter the territory and decide, where the strengths are, weaknesses, what to prepare for. So he sends out 12 spies. You guys know this story. They come back after exploring for some time, and we find this passage in Numbers chapter 13, verse 26. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is the fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, blah, blah. So let's go down to verse 31. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Now, despite Joshua and Caleb's good report, the 10 spies with that report swayed the Israelites. Israelites then refused to go into Canaan. God got angry, if you remember. The punishment was God said to the Israelites, every single one of you of this generation, because of your lack of faith in me, is going to die in the desert. You're going to wander for 40 years until you're all dead. I'll bring in the next generation to conquer Canaan. That's where our story begins. Joshua chapter 2, Joshua, who now is the commander of the Israelites, sends out 2 spies specifically to go look at the land and the city of Jericho. And then Joshua chapter 2, they come back with this report. Truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands. Moreover, all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before us. Quite a different impression. Quite a different report. What accounts for the difference? Well, you might say, well, they learned their lesson. They didn't want to wander for another 40 years in the desert. Let me suggest to you, though, that the big difference between the first spies and the second spies was a woman. A woman of great faith in action. A pagan woman of great faith in action. A prostitute pagan woman of great faith in action. That's our story today. Joshua chapter 2, verse 1. And Joshua son of Nun secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. If you had read that for the first time, wouldn't that raise a flag? What, could Jewish boys, the first place they go was a house of prostitution? What are they? What's the point? Why were they there? They didn't have Holiday Inns, obviously. Brothels also presented the opportunity for overnight stays, for residency, for staying. So if you were a wanderer, a traveler, you would likely go to a brothel to find a place to stay for the night. You didn't know any better. Obviously not ideal, but that's what was available. Now, the question, though, is why this specific One, why Rahab? I don't think they came into the city, turned right, and looked at the first brothel and said, let's stay here, it's close. Let me suggest that I think God sent these two spies specifically to Rahab, because God knew Rahab had something to say that these spies needed to hear. So he directed them to her. Verse 2, the king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they had come to spy out the whole land. But the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. She said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, the men left. I don't know which way they went out. Go after them quickly, you may catch up with them. But she had taken them up the roof, hid them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Now, it may bother you a little bit that Rahab lied and seems to be condoned for it. Think about that a second, though. Let's say we had a mass shooter walk through that door and said, is there anyone else in this building? You think we would say, sure, downstairs there's 5 kids and 2 teachers. Of course we would. We'd lie. No, this is everybody. Well, give me a more exact analogy. A German SS soldier comes to your door to do a house search to make sure you're not hiding Jews. And you have a secret room upstairs in which you have a whole family of Jews. And they ask you, are you alone here? Is this all there is? Yep. This is all there is. Yeah, she lied. She lied to prevent a greater evil than the evil of lying. And that's why I think there's nothing ever said about how wrong, yes, lying is, but in this particular case, it had a purpose. Verse 8, before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. Does that sound familiar? That's where the spies got that phrase that they told Joshua. The people are melting in fear before us. They heard it first from Rahab. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and to Og, the 2 kings and Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So she let them down by a rope through the window, and for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. Now she said to them, go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on their way. Verse 17 to 20 has this arrangement where they tell her to leave the scarlet cord outside the wall when we attack, and you will be protected if you do so. If not, then all bets are off. Verse 21, she says, agreed, let it be as you say. So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. When they left, they went into the hills and stayed there 3 days until the pursuers had searched all along the road and returned without finding them. Then the 2 men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, came to Joshua, son of Nun, and told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, the Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands, and the people are melting in fear before us. Good story. We'll come back to the conclusion up here in a minute, but I wanted us to jump ahead to Rahab in the New Testament. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30 to 31, there's an interesting passage here, and I think it's interesting for a couple purposes. One, let's read it together, verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Rachel gets a listing in this book of heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, majority of whom are men, to say, here's another example of faithfulness. You know who's not listed in there, in that passage? Joshua. I find that interesting. Joshua, the commander of the Israelites, who led them into victory over Jericho and conquest of Canaan, not mentioned. Rahab, the prostitute, is. Then in 2 Timothy chapter 2, or excuse me, not 2 Timothy, James chapter 2, there's a passage that also includes Rahab, but we're going to look at something to introduce that passage. Go ahead and show the chart up there that we came up with, if you can. There you go. This is something, I did not develop this. I stole this off the internet from another preacher. He probably stole it from another preacher. So today you've learned that preachers condone lying and they steal intellectual property from each other. So on the left-hand axis is belief, starting at the bottom, the zero, and quantities going up. On the horizontal axis is action. And what we're going to look at very briefly is these four quadrants between the correspondence between belief and action. All right? So go ahead and go to the next one. And this is what we'll stay at this one. Even when I start reading James, we'll stay here. So in the lower left-hand quadrant, it says low belief, low action. All right? Not many people fall into this quadrant. It's hard to find someone who's totally passive in beliefs and action. Most people believe something or act. Even anarchists who don't like any kind of structure, that's their belief, to destroy and tear down. So not very many people live in that one. The one on the other side, on the lower right-hand corner, low belief, high action, actually describes a lot of people in our culture nowadays. They may not have a belief in God, or they may not have a higher worldview, but they know they need to be doing something. They want to do good, do justice, do mercy. They want to help the homeless. They want to stop poverty. They want to stop sex trafficking. They want to clean up the environment, help the environment. They want to do things, but they don't really have a pervasive worldview that motivates them to do it, or a reason. If you were going to ask them why you do these things, they may say, well, it's just the right thing to do. Well, what makes it right? They wouldn't have an explanation for that other than the fact that it's just they want to do something. They know there should be making a difference. The top two is the two that we'll spend time on here just for a few minutes that really we're going to fall into. One of these two quadrants. In James chapter 2, he describes these two quadrants this way. In verse 14, what good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? That's that top left-hand quadrant. High belief in God, we'll say, because we're looking at this from our perspective as Christians. Low action. James says, what good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save him? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it's not accompanied by action, is dead. There's this phrase in our culture that's called virtue signaling. I don't know if you've heard of that before. People change their Facebook or their Instagram profiles with a color or a flag or something like that to demonstrate that they support a certain movement or a certain principle. And they want everyone to know that they support it. Or they'll put a bumper sticker on their car, or they'll put a sign in their yard, this house believes blah, 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 blah. But they don't do anything about it. They don't actually contribute to anything other than changing their profile picture or putting a sign in their yard. That's called virtue signaling. I want everyone to know I'm passionate about this. I believe in this. Well, what do you do about it? Nothing. What good is it then? That's virtue signaling for them. For us, James is saying, great. You believe in God. What do you do with that? Nothing. Good. That's a dead faith. He goes on to say, but someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. There are those who are evidently telling James, look, there are high belief Christians and there are high action Christians. You, James, are high action Christian. Good for you. Go out there and save the world. Those of us, we have high belief. That's our gift. That's what we believe in. James says, show me your faith without deeds, and I'll show you my faith by what I do. You say that, James says. You say you have belief. How do I know? How can it be proven? You don't do anything. I say I have faith, and I'll show you what that means, what I do that reflects that faith. I can prove I have faith. You say it. He goes on to nail this point home by saying, you believe there is one God, good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. If James had access to our English language, I think he would have said, you believe there is one God. Big whoop-de-doo. Even the demons believe that. And when they think about it, they shudder. He says, you foolish man, you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless. And then he goes on to talk about Abraham, and then he gets to the part that I wanted to reference in verse 25. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. We have this phrase called brain dead. Unfortunately, through trauma or some accident or something serious, a person can be dead in their brain, but their body can continue on if we put the right technology into it and circulate their air for them, circulate their blood for them, give them a feeding tube. We can keep a person alive without a brain almost indefinitely. But most people choose, family members, not to continue to do that for someone because we understand that that person is gone. Yeah, their body's there, we can keep it alive, but the essence that's them, their soul, their mind, it's not there anymore. So we use a term like we pull the plug. We stop all the interventions and the body dies. Paul is saying that's what Christians are like who say they have no faith, have faith but no deeds. They're faith dead. They're brain dead. It's just a body. Might as well pull the plug. Rahab was used as an example of that upper right-hand quadrant up there. High belief, high action. She not only believed, she acted on it. Back to Joshua. Into the stories you all know, Joshua marched to Jericho with the Israelites. God had told him to march every day once around the city for 6 days. On the seventh day, march 7 times. The walls came crashing down on that 7th day. And in Joshua chapter 6, verse 24, it says, then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. That doesn't tell the whole story, though. She not only lived among the Israelites, she married an Israelite named Salmon. Rahab and Salmon had a son named Boaz. Boaz married a woman named Ruth. Ruth and Boaz had a son named Obed. Obed had a son named Jesse. Jesse had a son named David, who was King David. That put her, Rahab, as Matthew tells us in Matthew chapter 1, in the genealogy of Jesus. It's interesting, in the New Testament, Rahab, except for in Matthew, and I think it's because Matthew couldn't bring himself to use the word prostitute in the genealogy of Jesus, but everywhere else she's mentioned, it's always Rahab the prostitute. It's almost like Rahab is her first name, second name prostitute, last name. And you would think that didn't seem to be very loving. To pigeonhole her like that. She was a prostitute. Why keep referring to her as Rahab, the prostitute? And I think it's because it reminds us of something. God can use a Jewish, beautiful woman to become a queen, like Esther, and save his nation. God can use a strong Jewish boy to kill a giant and rule his nation. God can use another strong Jewish boy who's had a genius at administration, who could interpret dreams and read writings on walls, to influence a pagan king and escape a lion's den. But he also can use an unchurched pagan prostitute to inspire a nation to go to war and be victorious. And then have godly children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who will influence through the genealogy to give birth to a Messiah. That's an inspiration for us. When I think about Rahab and what she accomplished, she didn't kill a giant. She didn't interpret a dream. She didn't become queen. But she did encourage. God brought some men into her life for a specific purpose so that she could put faith in them, to encourage them to go out and to believe. When I talked about these stories to inspire us, allow us to relate to them. It's hard to relate to a queen. It may be hard to relate to a shepherd who can sling a stone. But we all can relate to encouragement, to having children. It's not that God's going to use us personally to do all those things, but he may be bringing people into our lives that we turn around and encourage to do those things. That's our part. That's our role. And as I said before, we may not have in our lives the ability to do great things, but our children might, or our children's children might, or their children might. And that our calling by God is just to be that person, that grandparent, who inspires that person down the road. If we believe and we act. I pray that Rahab inspires us to do that. Let's stand and sing.